right, so welcome everybody. My name is Scott Sauber, and today I'm going to talk to you about practical AI tooling tips for the too busy developer. If you're interested, I already have posted these slides up on my blog. It's just my first and last name, scottsauber.com. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm pretty much that everywhere. So just to make sure you're in the right room, and then for those of you online, this is kind of who I had in mind when I created this talk. So people are like looking for ideas on how to best leverage AI because I find a lot of people have this like FOMO feeling with AI where they hear a bunch of people are doing AI, but maybe they're not sure if they're doing it right and things like that. A lot of people are also like too busy just shipping business value. And AI has really accelerated, especially over the last like 3 months. And we'll kind of talk about that here in a little bit. This is more like a 100 to 200 level talk. So I'm not going to get super deep into like custom plugins and things like that. But hopefully this will give you some ideas. And I find a lot of people who are using AI tools are just like leveraging Copilot autocomplete or something like that, not leveraging a lot of these other things that are out there. So I'm going to show you something beyond just that. And really, this is like an all-day workshop that I'm going to try and cram into 52 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. So just so I know who's in the room, who's using AI tools every single day? Okay, probably 2/3 of the room. How many people are using Copilot today? Okay, probably half the room. How about Claude Code? Okay, maybe a quarter, maybe 20%. How about Cursor? Couple, Windsurf? Anything else people are using? Yeah, Codex? Yep. You're on the bleeding edge. Nice.
You're right.
Hero? AWS fan in the room? Cool. Anybody else? All right, so it's not obvious. There's a lot of these different tools that are out there. So we're going to talk about a few different things here. First off, I'm just going to call the elephant in the room of like, are we still going to have jobs? We're going to talk about that for a little bit. Then I'll kind of define a lot of the AI buzzwords like context, instruction, skills, all these types of things. Also show like live demos of Copilot and Claude Code. And then I'll give some like practical tips that literally you can use when this presentation's over and start implementing back at work. So really just my goals today, just give you some ideas on things you can do today and also kind of give you a glimpse of where AI is going in the future. So who am I? I'm the Director of Engineering at Lean Techniques. We're a software consulting company based here in Des Moines, roughly 160 people. So we work with like Fortune 500 companies down to startups and everything in between. Microsoft MVP, also have a couple of courses on Dome Train, Regate Community Ambassador, and I help run this Iowa.net user group with a few other folks. Okay. So first off, I talked about, am I going to be out of a job? So let's just call the elephant in the room because I think the question to this is like, I think we're all a little concerned, no matter what industry you're in, if you're using something digitally, you're not so sure, like, is AI going to take my job? And I'll give you my thoughts about that. Like if we zoom in on software development specifically, if we think about who typically was like the best engineering teams, the best technology teams over the last 25 years, typically they had these more modern engineering practices. And this is actually backed up by research called DORA, which stands for DevOps Research Assessment. It's not the Explorer, it's DevOps Research Assessment. That backed up this data saying, hey, if you're doing some of these things, like you have quick feedback loops, you're working in small batches, you have a learning culture, you have automated tests, you do CI/CD pipelines, technically DORA doesn't say cloud, they say flexible infrastructure, but the cloud can give you flexible infrastructure. You're doing database automation, you're doing like monitoring and observability of your system, so you get alerted when things go wrong and you're able to troubleshoot when things go wrong and all of those types of things. All right, we're back. All right, so if I go back to that list, which ones of these are still relevant in an AI-dominated world? What do you think? Yeah. Every single one of them, that is the correct answer. And to your point, I think things like, especially like working in small batches and fast feedback and things like that are even more important in an AI dominated world than they used to be before. So if you're already doing these things, like the fundamentals don't change at the end of the day with AI tooling. So just kind of want to share that like not a lot changes from a fundamental level with AI tools. There's also this idea of Jevons paradox. So this is the idea that when something gets more efficient, like a resource gets more efficient, we actually use it more, not less. So some examples of this, when we made more fuel efficient engines, it caused us to actually travel more and use more fuel at the end of the day, even though fuel got cheaper when we created more fuel efficient engines. So that's kind of like this paradox of you make something more efficient, but you actually use it more when it becomes more efficient than less. Same with like faster internet speeds. Like I'm guessing many of us in this room have gigabit back at home and we're streaming. So like we have faster internet than we've ever had before, and we're pushing that technology to further limits than we ever have before. So if that history repeats itself, then what you could imagine is we end up creating more software, not less, because it gets faster and more efficient to create more software. As well as this changes potentially the build versus buy equation, because I don't know about you, like how many people have created or have are maintaining third-party systems that they have to interact with? Anybody like ERP, CRM, CMSs, those kinds of things? How many of you have customized those so much that you can't move off of those systems? Yeah, I see a few people nodding and laughing. And so what happens is sometimes we buy these systems off the shelf and customize them, and then we almost get the worst of build and buy because we don't change, like our business doesn't change their processes to conform to how the tool works. They kind of shoehorn in their processes into the tool. So maybe instead we'll start building some of these systems when they're cheaper to build in the future. So good news is we all still have jobs, but I do think they are changing. And I do think there's always going to be a place for somebody who can connect business and technology at the end of the day. Okay. There's also this pretty provocative statement from the Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, who said SaaS is dead, which is quite the statement from a guy who's has a financial report that has a line item for Office, which is SaaS. Now, I'm not saying everybody's going to create their own like Exchange or Outlook or anything like that. But his argument is he thinks that SaaS will start to be uh, something that kind of goes down over time. And if you've been watching the stock markets in the last week, the stock market is also kind of thinking that way as well. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there that we might be building more software than we're buying in the future. Kind of the last thing to frame up before we get into the nitty-gritty details is these tools are the worst they will ever be today. So they're going to only get better if you fast forward like a year from now, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. These tools are only going to get better over time. So you can't really ignore them. You have to start to dive in. I think now is a good time to start doing that if you haven't been fully diving in yet. All right, so let's talk about AI tools. I kind of alluded to this earlier when we talked about Dora, but AI is an amplifier. So if you have good practices, you are able to move faster at high quality with AI. But if you have bad practices, you're probably going to start shipping what's known as AI slop a lot, where you're shipping a lot of code, but it's causing a lot of bugs, a lot of rework, and those kinds of things. So AI is going to amplify things depending on if your practices are good or not. So, for instance, how do you verify that your app works? We'll kind of show an example of this here a little bit later, but AI is able to like automatically compile your app, automatically run your tests, run a linter, run a formatter, and make sure that everything's still within what you expect. So, kind of the question is like, are you doing these things already? And if you're not, you need to start because this is really where that feedback loop comes in, especially with AI. As well as AI is not perfect. Like I've got some demos later that I'm not exactly sure how they're going to go because AI is non-deterministic. So we'll see how that goes. But you need to have that judgment of, hey, when AI goes off the rails, I need to reel it back in. So you can't just blindly accept what AI is doing. And I've also seen where people's like pull request output goes from like, 2 to 10x when leveraged correctly. But the downside of that is what are your PR practices today? Do you have pull requests that are sitting for like days or longer, right? I see a few people smiling. Also, do you rubber stamp PRs? Do you just like, hey, somebody's got a 50 file change and boom, 30 seconds later it's accepted? That's also going to be a problem when it comes to AI because you have your practices aren't ideal, and you're going to end up reviewing a lot more code than you're writing. And ultimately, you still own the code, not AI. So you're still responsible for the code, even if you didn't write it yourself. You're still the one who approved it, merged it, all of that kind of stuff. So you can't blame AI for something going off the rails. All right. Let's just review a few different concepts in AI tools. So large language models, basically at a high level, this is just your engine that's trained on a bunch of text at the end of the day. So it's trained on like how C# works, how ASP.NET Core works, how Azure works, those kinds of things. And then it's literally just predicting what like the next word or token is at a time. So it knows if you write an if statement in C#, you do an if, and then it's going to guess a parentheses next and things like that. So it's just basically a probabilistic engine where it's trying to guess what the next word should be or the next token should be. So often people just say models instead of large language models. But people ask me all the time, like, hey, what are the best models out there? And that's kind of a misnomer because really, at the end of the day, the best models are just about trade-offs. So you kind of have these like three things of like how accurate do you want the model to be? How much are you willing to pay? And how fast do you want it to respond? Those are kind of the three levers when you're picking a different AI model. And so you have trade-offs with a lot of these different AI models. Now, I will say Claude Opus 4.5 is, I'll say, the best model out there, and that just got released in November. And honestly, it's like a huge game changer. So if you're not using Claude Opus 4.5, highly recommend giving it a shot because it's probably the best model I've seen for like generating lots of code and very accurate and high quality code. But the downside is Opus 4.5 is by far the most expensive model that's out there, and it's often slower. So that's kind of a trade-off you're making for accuracy versus cost and speed. On the flip side, there's a model called Haiku, which responds very quickly, but it's not as comprehensive as Opus is. So if you just are like, usually what I use like Haiku for is if you're just asking a question, you normally ask Google. Haiku is usually really good at that, and it'll respond, pretty much instantaneously or like within a second. Versus Opus will probably think for 4, 5, 10 seconds, depending on what you're asking it to do. All right, next one. But literally, like this changes on what model is the best. Literally changes all the time. Like Anthropic's supposed to release new models this week, supposedly today. So this might be out of date. So like these models are changing like on a seriously monthly basis. Like it is crazy the pace of change with this stuff. All right, next thing I want to define is context. So this is the information that an LLM is allowed to consider when it's trying to process your request. So LLMs have what's called a limited context window, which means just like honestly, AI is a lot like humans in a lot of ways. And just like humans, we can only keep so much information in our head. AI is kind of the same way. So what makes up a context is like your previous conversation history, the code that's in your repository, the user prompt of like, hey, what you asked it to do, the instructions. We'll get into that here in a second. And this is a pretty big key is if you ever have AI go off the rails, clearing context is key because sometimes when you have too much in your head, it can start hallucinating and doing things that it really shouldn't, that you're not intending for it to do. So big key is like once you're done with one task, just start a new chat session and clear that context. There's also this idea of compacting, which is basically like as your conversation history grows, it's going to start summarizing what you said rather than having the full context history or conversation history. So eventually, as you start summarizing and you're summarizing summaries, it starts to like basically guess wrong and not have the full context. So that's another reason for clearing your context. All right. So that's LLMs and context, but now we kind of unify those with these AI dev tools. So we've got basically AI dev tools like Copilot, Cursor, Claude Code, kind of unifies these models with your code bases to provide that as a context. Because if you just go to ChatGPT and you don't connect your code base, it doesn't have that context. You can just ask it kind of generic questions. So it combines those things to kind of get the best results. So, and this is what was reflected here. GitHub Copilot is by far the most ubiquitous that I see in the market, especially in enterprises, because a lot of you are using like GitHub already or have Microsoft licenses. So it's really easy to use Copilot. Claude Code is probably my favorite dev tool. Not probably, it is my favorite dev tool. And I think it's like way better than Copilot, like way huge steps above. And to give you an idea of, again, how fast the stuff moved, Claude Code got released in preview a year ago and went general availability in May. So like this is the best tool out there, has been in the public for like a year or less. So again, this stuff is just moving at an insane pace if you kind of stay on the bleeding edge. I do think Cursor has the best autocomplete. So if you people are using Cursor, I think that's got the best autocomplete out there. But there's just tons of other tools out there, and I expect a lot of these tools to start to contract and people to basically like give up because they're not winning market share at the end of the day. Again, I said Claude Code is the best, but that's just been my experiences and my opinions based on what I've used it for. So it might vary. Your experiences might vary. But I've seen a lot of people who just use it for autocomplete, but there's so much more to AI dev tools. So let's talk about modes here real quick. How many people are using different modes in Copilot or Claude Code or something else?
Agent mode.
Yep, like agent mode, ask mode, edit mode. Maybe like a quarter of the room, a third of the room, half the room, or people are eating pizza, one of the two. So there's a few different modes that you can throw these dev tools in. First, you got ask mode. This is basically ChatGPT. You ask it a question, it gives you an answer. There's also plan mode. So this is a relatively newish feature in a lot of tools, but this is the idea of it starts to ask you questions and formulate your prompt at the end of the day that you're going to feed into an agent mode or an edit mode. The plan also asks you questions along the way. So if it's not really sure what you're talking about, it'll ask you questions to clarify your intent. And really, I would say if you're trying to implement a feature, you should be using plan mode first and kind of itemize out everything, because AI is really good when you give it a lot of context and tell it exactly what you want it to do. And plan mode forces you into answering a lot of those questions. Mode is kind of where you go and say like, hey, go implement this feature, fix the failing tests, those kinds of things where you don't give it a ton of context, but it just kind of figures things out. Whereas edit mode, you might say it might be more like precision, saying, hey, I want you to change this specific thing. It doesn't have as much context, but if you know exactly what you need to change and where, that's kind of where edit mode comes in. Honestly, I don't really use edit mode at all, but it is a thing that a lot of tools have. All right, let's next talk about instructions. How many people are using like instructions or an agents MD file or any of that kind of stuff? Okay, again, maybe a quarter of the room, a third of the room. This is honestly, like if you're not doing this, this is one of the biggest takeaways you can have is you should be doing this. So instructions are just a set of markdown files to determine your like team's coding patterns, architecture patterns, those kinds of things. And you can also set it like an org level too if you want. So if you want all the teams to do these kinds of things, like in GitHub, you can do that. For instance, you can put in like in my opinion, I don't like having arrange, act, assert comments when I'm writing tests. And AI tools love having arrange, act, assert comments in tests. So that's one of the first things I'll throw in an instructions file is don't do that. It listens to me most of the time, like probably 95% of the time. But like you can actually just tell it, hey, AI, go create me an instructions file based on the repository that I have, based on this architecture that's already there. And it does a really good job, a very comprehensive job of creating your instructions file. Now, another tip is anytime the agent does literally anything you didn't want it to do, that should go back into your instructions file saying, hey, I want you to don't do this instead, or I want you to always do this. So like anytime you're like manually fixing something, you should be immediately thinking, oh shoot, I should go update my instructions file or my rules file to not have that happen again. So to give you an idea, if you haven't seen instructions file, so this is from the .NET Aspire repository. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see that in the back, but see if I can zoom in a little bit. So the idea here is you can say like, hey, I want you to apply this code formatting. Also down here at the bottom, if I can go down, I can't, but it's like saying, hey, here's how we run our builds. I want you to do this. Here's how we run tests, those kinds of things. And that is also something that AI can take and start to do that stuff for you. So rather than like, you interacting with AI and it does something, you look, review it, then you run your tests and build it, you can actually have AI just be in a loop and have it do that for you. So it's auto building, making sure it compiles, because I'm guessing if your app doesn't compile, I'm going to say a pretty high chance it doesn't work. And if you don't have, like if your tests aren't passing, obviously that's not good either. And so it'll actually keep trying, like if it messes up, it'll just keep trying in a loop and say like, oop, it doesn't compile yet. Let me make this change. Let me figure out why and make this change. And we'll take a look at that here in a second. Now, the fun part is instructions, and we'll kind of see this in some of these other things, is instructions was kind of something that these different tools like Copilot and Claude Code and others did in isolation, and they didn't really talk to each other because basically I think Cursor might have been the first one with Cursor rules, and they kind of implemented it for Cursor, and then everybody else kind of followed along. So you're going to see this like bifurcation of how you do instructions on these different tools. So what I mean by that is every tool by default will respect an agents.md file in the root of your repository, but Cursor looks for things also in like a .cursor rules file or a .cursor folder under rules. Claude looks for a Claude MD file. Gemini looks for Gemini MD file. Copilot has that path to get to Copilot instructions. So you just have like all these tools by default look one place, and then now they're trying to like standardize again on, okay, we should all be looking in the exact same place. Now, Copilot will bring in like a Claude.md file, so some of these tools will be nice and pull this stuff in, but Claude Code in general isn't really great about pulling in other people's instructions. So reason why I bring that up is like if your team, like some of your teams using Copilot, some of your teams using Claude Code, like you probably want to try and do the like agents.md file and standardize on some of these things. That way it's always getting pulled in if you're kind of in that like mixed tooling environment. So if any of you have seen this XKCDC or KCD comic of, hey, we've got these 14 competing standards. I know we should invent a 15th standard to unify them all. And now we've got 15 competing standards. That's kind of what is happening here. They like all these tools kind of do their own thing in isolation, and then they come back later and standardize. And we'll also see that when we talk about skills now. So with skills, it's also still just markdown files at the end of the day. But if you think about it, let's say you've got a repository that's got a back end and a front end. You might have different rules for the back end than you have for the front end, or you might have rules about making database changes. And if you think about that, the instructions file gets loaded into your context window every single time, even if you're just making a database change. Like you might not be doing a front end change or a back end change, but it's still going to load up that into its context. So the idea behind skills is, what if we were smart and just used the different instructions that we needed? So basically have the tool evaluate, oh, you're just making a front end change. Let me just pull in the front end instructions. So this in theory means it runs faster, it's cheaper, and all of those kinds of things because you're not pulling in that context window and eating up tokens. So again, we have this bifurcation of things where GitHub by default looks for this .github folder, Claude looks for this .claude folder, which is technically also recognized by Claude 2 or Copilot 2. But kind of the new standard is to put in a .agent folder and then skills folder. And basically how it works is you just have like a .agent/skills and then your skill name. So this might be like front end coding or something like that. And then a skill.markdown file that says, here's my front end coding, guidelines and things like that. You can also create skills to do different things. Like, for instance, you might have it want to check like, hey, did the build pass or things like that out on GitHub. So you can also create skills to kind of do some custom stuff as well. And then the tool is smart enough to know when to pull those things in. Again, just to show you how fast this stuff is moving, this just became a thing in October. So if it hasn't sunk in yet, this stuff is moving pretty fast. And what was the latest and greatest 6 months ago is no longer the latest and greatest. There's also a bunch of skills out there. So if you look out on some public repositories, so there's one out there from Anthropic, but people are starting to publish skills that then you can kind of consume. So not everybody's recreating their own skills. So what that looks like, if I zoom in here a little bit, is the key here is that description that you've got here. So basically, rather than loading in the entire context of all of your different things that you want, it just loads in the description and it dynamically knows, oh, like in this case, this is a front end skill. I'm going to change some front end code. So I'm going to pull that front end skill in dynamically. So really all you're eating for token wise is the description, and then it's pulling in this skill as it's needed. So again, it saves tokens, makes things faster, and doesn't pollute your context window. So that's really the reason behind skills. Now, a fun part is, in theory, everything I said sounds pretty good, right? It sounds like, okay, it's going to save us money and things like that. And skills should be just as good in theory. But in practice, Vercel just came out with a study a week ago that says, actually, we don't think skills performs well as chucking everything in the instructions file. So if you're kind of on this stuff and threw everything in your into skills, you might want to consider rolling that back. So this is again a good example of we're still iterating like, well, what right is in the AI tooling space. So maybe hold off moving to skills. So to show you what Vercel came up with, they had a baseline of not having skills at all, and they said, and they were trying to see like, hey, how often does it call the build or the test or the linter? And then by default, rather than calling it 100% of the time, like you see the agents.md at the bottom calls it 100% of the time when needed. It only called it, somewhere between 58 to 84% of the time, depending on what the skill was. So, which obviously isn't really useful, right? Because then it's like if I put my thing that said, hey, don't add arrange, act, assert comments, and it doesn't actually load the skill, and I start generating tests and it's got arrange, act, assert comments, I'm not going to be super happy. So, I haven't personally felt this myself, but I have noticed that at times it doesn't follow what I ask, and I wonder if it's because sometimes I'm using skills. So again, this is kind of like a space to watch, and curious if that ends up getting better. My guess is the tools will keep getting better, and skills will still be a thing long term. But again, this is like something that just came out a week ago where they did a bunch of tests and came to this realization. So if you're using skills, just be aware that there is this limitation out there. All right. How many people are using skills, by the way? 2, 3, 4 people, 5 people? Okay, cool. So let's move on to talk about Copilot coding agents and some friends. So typically what we think about with AI dev tools is we think about, hey, let's run some AI tools on our machines. But now there's a lot of tools that you can actually interact with from a browser. So I could, and I've done this, like I've been on my phone and just told, hey, go do this thing for a personal project, and it went off and did the thing. And I'll show an example of this in a second. So literally you just tell it what to do and assign it a task or a GitHub issue, and then you can watch the progress if you want. But when it's done, it'll actually submit a PR and say, hey, I'm done with this. Do you want to go review it now? And you can interact with it and say like, nope, don't do that. Change this and leave comments, and it will do that for you. So you don't even need, you just need a web browser. You don't even need any of these tools running locally. You can also create what's called agents that are specialized for certain tasks. So if you have a certain task you do over and over and over again, you basically create this custom instructions file. Again, it's just Markdown saying, hey, here's how you should behave. And then when you create a task, you can assign that particular agent that task. So for instance, something that we're doing at our clients is we use feature toggles in a lot of places, and we have a feature toggle remover agent. So for those of you using feature toggles, that's usually a pretty tedious thing to do. Usually you're just kind of like deleting an if else block and maybe updating some tests and things like that. And we've created an agent that you just say, hey, go remove this feature toggle because now we're flipped on in production or whatever the case is. And it submits a PR and then we just review it and we don't actually have to do any of the coding ourselves. Now, this is a feature, and I'll show it here in a second. This is a feature that is not coming to Azure DevOps. How many people are in Azure DevOps here? Okay, probably like half the room. So this is where I'm going to go on a little tangent here about Azure DevOps versus GitHub. So Microsoft says we can share this publicly, and they claim that they have shared this publicly, even though I'd argue that they haven't. But what they say about Azure DevOps versus GitHub is the strategic long-term investment is in GitHub, not Azure DevOps. So the reason why I bring that up is this is a good example of this feature only exists in GitHub. So there's like 50 to 100 people working on Azure DevOps, and there's thousands working on GitHub. So Microsoft owns both. And you can imagine that they're probably not going to add a lot of features to Azure DevOps going forward. So if you are on Azure DevOps, I would highly recommend you take a look at moving to GitHub because, again, what they say, and this is like verbatim, the strategic long-term investment is in GitHub, not Azure DevOps. Now, that said, don't freak out and say like you have to move tomorrow. Otherwise, it's going to go away because Microsoft is really good about keeping backwards compatibility. But I would say you should probably move in the next, I'm going to say like 1 to 2 years or so, because not because it's going to go away, but I think a lot of these features, and I'll show some more later, that are only coming to GitHub, not Azure DevOps. So just sharing that out there. It's kind of tangential, but I think this is a good example of how Microsoft is investing in GitHub, not Azure DevOps. All right. I've been talking for way too long, so let's go ahead and do some coding. So if you go to github.com, you will have access to the GitHub Copilot coding agent. So literally you'll come in here and you can either ask it, so you can ask changes about your code base, your organization, or in my case, I want to give it a task. So I've got an application here. If I go over here, super simple. It's just a Blazor app, and I'm just gonna it's just a to-do list. So it's like task 1, task 2, and I can check it off. I can delete things, all that kind of stuff. Nothing crazy. So what I want though is when I click that button, I want it to pop up and say, hey, are you sure you want to delete this? Like I don't want it to just delete it in case I accidentally click on that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say add a delete confirmation modal to the delete functionality and have the buttons be yes and no, where yes deletes it and no cancels and does nothing. This is where also when I was talking, and you can pick what repository you're targeting. This is also where I said you can create custom agents, and this is where you could say, hey, this is my feature toggle remover agent and have it pick that. You can also pick what model you want. I'm going to use Opus 4.5, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit send. So once you do that, it's going to kick off a session here, and you can actually watch this session if you want, see what it's doing. So it's saying like, hey, Cobot's starting work. Can you guys see that in the back? Do I need to bump that up? It's good. Okay. So it's like, okay, I'm fueling the runtime agents, doing those things. I can actually open this in VS Code if I want. It's starting up the MCP server, doing a bunch of stuff. But I did this earlier, and just to show you kind of what it did is dismiss this. It added the delete functionality. So hey, when it's on delete, go ahead and pop open this modal. Now I can interact with this. Really what it did isn't super, we don't have to get into all that, but it actually included a screenshot too saying, hey, here's what this looks like. What do you think? Which is pretty cool. So you can also see what your original prompt was, and then I could interact with this and say hey, I want you to do this. Maybe I want that button not to be yes, because it feels weird that a yes button is red. To me, that should be the no button, or it should be outlined or something. So maybe I want to change that, but literally it's just commenting back and forth on the PR and things like that. So if I go back to the agent running. You can see it's starting to like tell you what it's doing. I should start exploring the directory structure. So you can actually like watch what it does. And it's pretty crazy that it's kind of figuring all that stuff out because I would say my prompt was like pretty good, but I didn't like go to the nth degree building out what I was telling it. So for instance, I didn't say like, hey, use blue for the yes or whatever it is, green for the yes. So that's just an example of like the more context you give these tools, the more accurate they will be. All right. So I've got 17 minutes, so let's breeze through a few of these other things. Copilot code reviews, or really Claude has this too, but you should be using AI for code reviews. How many people are using AI for code reviews today? Handful of people. What do you think about the code reviews? Like them? It's iffy? I'm kind of in between awesome and iffy. So I'd say like 70% of the comments are totally valid, which is great because if you're somebody who has good, like I'll say good judgment, you should be able to say like, oh, this one doesn't really matter and this one does. But if you're somebody who's like new to the industry, you might just blindly accept everything that it says. And sometimes that's not uh, leads to some bad things happening. So this is again a good example of AI as an amplifier. If you know what you're like, if you have experience and have that judgment, you can kind of amplify how fast you can move and the quality at which you can move. But if you're newer to the industry, and that's a whole nother topic of people new to the industry with AI, uh, you might not know which ones you should accept. So in my experience, about 70% of the time it's valid, but I still think that means everybody should be using it and you should be having, because that means 7 out of 10 comments are, helping with security, performance, code cleanliness, all of that kind of stuff. Not coming to Azure DevOps either. So this is another good example of Microsoft not investing in Azure DevOps, but they are investing in GitHub. So let's just do a demo of that real quick. So I've already assigned a PR over here to Copilot, but literally all you do is you come over here and just say Copilot, and you assign it as a reviewer, and then it'll kick off and start doing things. So you can see it says, hey, I've got this pull request. Here are the changes. I reviewed these changes. And then you can see some of the comments it left. So it's saying like, hey, you got public setters. Maybe you don't want to do that. Or in this case, this is an interesting one. So the component reloads the entire to-do list after every operation. So every time I clicked add, it pulls the to-do list from the back end. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't. So it's again kind of giving you like to me that's a pretty like cool advanced thing that's telling you that it knows how Blazor's component rendering works and all that kind of stuff. So it's not just giving you like, hey, you name this variable A, it should be more descriptive. It's actually giving you some real insight. And you can decide whether you want to commit the suggestion or things like that. Another thing I want to show is you can also globally require this. So you can say like on a repo level saying Copilot, yep, I need to be in the right spot. So if I go create a new branch rule set, which is kind of like, where you require pull requests and things like that. If you come down here, you can say automatically request a Copilot code review, and you can say, hey, review any new pushes and also review draft pull requests. So it's literally a checkbox and boom, Copilot starts reviewing all of your code. And you can set this at a higher level than the repo too, if you want. So you can set this at like an org level as well. So just want to show that because it sounds like more than half the room is not using AI to do code reviews. And again, I would highly recommend that you start doing that. All right, so usually what my workflow looks like is I plan pretty extensively so I can do something called one-shotting, which is kind of this idea of you submit one prompt and it does exactly what you want the first time. And so if you go to plan mode first, it'll help you build out that prompt versus what I did in the coding agent where I just typed out like yes, no. Like it might have asked me, hey, what color do you want these buttons to be? So then I don't have to have that back and forth. I can just one-shot things. Most plans only take, a minute or two to create. And usually the planning asks you those clarifying questions. And then it'll start creating tasks. So I'll literally have like, okay, first I need kind of like what you saw with the coding agent where it's like, okay, first I need to scan the directory and see what's going on. you can actually, when it creates these tasks of, okay, first I need to create like a modal and things like that, you can ask it to add a validation line to say, hey, to know when you're done with this, or like add a validation line to determine when you're done with this particular task. So then AI can kind of know when it's done and complete after that. So that's also another tip, is to add a validation line on how it validates it's done. Okay, so I only have 12 minutes here, so I'm going to breeze through this real quick. But I'm going to show Claude Code a little bit for those of you who haven't seen it. So there's a few different ways to interact with Claude Code. I'm going to show you two ways. The first way is through the desktop app. So you pick like, hey, here's the repository I want. And I can say the exact same thing that I said before. So I'm going to grab my actual original prompt over here so you don't have to watch me type again. And I'm going to have it do a, so not pasting. There it goes. I'm going to have it do the exact same thing, just locally, basically. So this is running on my machine, not out on the web. And I'm going to send it to plan mode first. So we'll see what that does. So usually this takes a little bit and starts interacting with you, and then it'll start asking you questions. And then eventually when it thinks it's done, it'll say, hey, I want to go ahead and start my implementation. And then you can say, yes, go ahead. Or you can say, nope, you're not done. I want you to do this instead. So you can watch what it's doing. It's doing a lot of different things. But I actually used Claude Code to generate that. I used Claude Code to generate the entire project that you saw, like from Git repository, like the whole create the solution, the projects, all of that kind of stuff, and all the associated automated tests as well. So I did like there's probably like 10,000-ish lines in of code that I generated in probably like 20, 30 minutes. Yeah.
Did it put it in work three for you automatically?
Nope. So that's a question. So it does not. So the question was, did it put you in work tree mode automatically? So to talk about this real quick is rather than having branches, you can have work trees, which is basically like a branch, but it's isolated. So it's almost like a copy of your repository. So by default, Git, you can't work on multiple branches at once. And what this work trees allow you to do is it'll basically create you a work tree so you can technically interact with the exact same repository in multiple sessions. So these are just sessions that are running. So I can kick off new sessions. I can have like 4 different things going on at once in the same repository, which when I first heard this, as somebody who's advocated for like WIP limits and things like that in my career and people not multitasking, I thought this would be like terrible, but it's actually not really terrible because you're not actively coding on those things. It's more like you're like a manager or like a tech lead saying, hey, go do this. And then they come back a few hours later, or, in this case, probably a few minutes later with some things. So it's honestly not that bad to like multitask in that case, which kind of breaks my brain a little bit because I've been telling people like, hey, don't multitask. And then here I am like advocating for multitasking or doing multitasking. So this is going to go ahead and run and create the plan. I'm going to kind of leave that to the side here because we only have 9 minutes. But another way of doing this too is you can actually have interact with Claude in a terminal. So this is another way of doing this. And basically behind the scenes, this is what the desktop app is doing, where you're interacting with the terminal and you can say the exact same thing there as well. As well as the terminal gives you like some, it's called slash commands, which allows you to like, for instance, this one literally just dropped today called Insights. And I did update Claude Code right before this demo. So that was maybe a questionable decision, but it does work. So you can say Insights and basically hit enter, and it will generate you. It'll look back at how you've used Claude Code and give you suggestions on how you should use Claude Code better, which is kind of crazy that Claude Code is helping you Claude Code better. Just kind of meta a little bit. All right, while that's running, I'm going to keep rolling through because I just got a few more things to cover, and then we'll look back at that if we have time. This is kind of where you start getting into even more advanced stuff with kind of these autonomous modes. So how many people have used like an autonomous mode like Ralph Wiggum before? One person. Awesome. Yeah. Yep. So, yep. Okay. So this is where you put your agent basically in a while loop because sometimes agents will be lazy where they'll like you tell it to do four things and it does three of the four and you're like, no, 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 do the fourth thing. And so what Ralph Wiggum mode is, which that's the character from The Simpsons, but that's what they call it, is came from Claude technically, well, a person that then Claude adopted. Uh, what this is it basically puts your agent in a loop. So people are literally running agents coding for like 8 hours. They'll like just define a ton of features, like 20 plus features, and say go, and then they'll go to sleep and come back the next day and see if it's done. So it's like running your tests for you, it's running your builds for you. In your plan you're creating, you're saying, hey, here's how to validate this and make sure that this works. And so literally it's coding while you're sleeping. Now, what I will say too is it is also eating up tokens. So it doesn't come for free. Usually you have like a plan where you can use so much tokens and things like that, or it costs you more money. So, but I just wanted to share this that like this is a pretty newish thing in the last couple months that people are starting to do. And Copilot released what they called Autopilot, which is exactly the exact same thing for the CLI. So Copilot also has a CLI like the Claude Code one, and it just came out last week that does the exact same thing. And I think stuff like this is probably where things are going longer term in the next year or two. But again, if we go back to those fundamentals, this is where tight feedback loops are extremely important because you don't want it to run for 8 hours and generates 20,000 lines of code and it's all garbage when you review it. So you need to be explicit about like, hey, here's how this feature should work. Here's how to validate it. Here's my automated test to run, all of those kinds of things, because otherwise AI is just going to go off the rails. Another important part of this is when it completes a task, it will clear the context window as well. So you're starting in that fresh loop as well. So it's not causing what's called context rot. But again, those validation lines I mentioned in plan mode are also important because it needs to know when it's done. So again, going back to compiling, testing, linting, formatting. Again, you should be doing those whether you're doing AI or not. All right. Let's talk for next few minutes about where things are going. So I kind of showed the Claude Code desktop where you kind of can have these multiple agents running different things in parallel. And I think these UIs that orchestrate these CLIs are where things are going. And I think like Claude Code doesn't really have good editor support where if you wanted to make a change, you could. I think that's kind of where things are going in the future. Now, OpenAI just dropped Codex, which they've got like four products named Codex, just like Microsoft has a million products named Copilot. But they called it Codex. That's pretty much this. So it's pretty much what you saw with Claude Code, where you had multiple sessions running, but also it's got an editor built in. VS Code also just dropped this yesterday too. So if you update VS Code, you can also have that session look as well. So I'll show a screenshot of that here in a second. But what this is meaning is the bottleneck is moving on this. So it's no longer writing code that's the bottleneck, it's reviewing code. So again, if we go back to what I was talking about earlier with like your pull request hygiene, basically, if you're just rubber stamping PRs and you're generating 10 times more code than you used to, you're probably going to generate, I don't know, 10 times or more bugs. So again, this you gotta be able to adjust your where you're spending your time. I also think voice is also the future. So you can speak, the average person can speak 120 words per minute. Probably more like 250, but the average person can only type 40 words per minute. So that means you can talk 3 times faster than you can type. So I also think that's going to be a future where you're telling agents what to do. The best devs I know that are doing a lot of these things are spending 80 to 90% of their day not writing code, they're spending it reviewing code. So this is a pretty big shift. And I think also this is kind of like this. I always like the act of writing code and like typing and things like that. But I think, but I've also really what I've liked is solving business problems. And I think we're going to have this like interesting reckoning basically of there's some people who are in this industry just for the cool tech, and there's some people who are in this industry for tech that solves actual problems. And I think the people who are just in it for the tech are gonna probably not like things as much long term because you're just changing how you're working. I also think the context window is going to expand. So I think it's going to be able to connect like your code base to it running in the cloud. So if you have a memory leak, I think it's going to be able to detect, hey, here's this memory leak, and here's where I think it's coming from in the code, and here's a PR to propose to fix it. So I think the context window on this stuff is just going to keep expanding over time, and these LLMs are going to get better and better at taking in large amounts of data. I think in the next 6 to 12 months, like I talked about a lot of things of like this just got released last week or yesterday and things like that. I think in the next 6 to 12 months, things will start to like settle down a little bit, or at least I hope so, because I can't imagine it not. But I think we'll start to figure out what the best practices are for some of these things because that's still honestly pretty up in the air. Like I have not used OpenAI Codex that came out Monday. And so if you see a resume that's like, I've been using OpenAI Codex for 2 years. It's probably not the case. All right, so I'm guessing a lot of you are using VS Code, so I figured I'd show a screenshot of what dropped yesterday with VS Code. But again, it looks very similar to what you saw with Claude Code, where you've got sessions and you can run multiple sessions at once and kick off different code bases. But you're also doing this in VS Code where you're in the context of an editor, so you can make manual changes if you want. But again, if you're making manual changes, your trigger should be, hey, should this be should I be doing something in the instructions file instead? All right, so some quick hitters used today. A lot of you aren't using instructions today. I think you should start using instructions. Again, anytime it doesn't do something you want, add it to the instructions. You should automatically add Copilot code reviews if you're on GitHub. Start with plan mode and add a validation for when it's complete. And then you can also use these tools not just for code generation, because I've been talking about that a lot today, but you can use it for like estimating how big something is, or creating stories, or explaining code, things like that as well. If you're not sure what model to pick, my default recommendation is pick one from Claude, because typically they have the best models. And like I said, Opus 4.5 is the best for now. But again, supposedly, it just dropped 6. Great. So model literally just dropped during this meeting. Great. What's that? Oh, 7's out? Yeah, yeah. Well, Sam Altman from OpenAI tweeted out saying they're going to have a big announcement today. So I'm like, great, right when I'm doing this talk. So again, another takeaway, things are changing all this time, just this week. I talked about these things already. Apparently Anthropic did drop this during this talk. So some people ask me like, how do I stay up to date? And how I do it is I follow people on social media. That's what it is. So who do I follow? Boris Cherny, I think is how you say his name. He created Claude Code. He like is very open about here's how we use Claude Code at Anthropic. So he's great. Lee Robinson, he's actually local. He used to work at Hy-Vee. Now he works at Cursor. He is a great follow as well. The VS Code account, the Claude AI account, and then Corey House also, who's a consultant. He's really good to follow as well. All right, so some takeaways from this. Hopefully I gave you some ideas on where AI is today and where it's going, as well as some practical things that you can actually use today with these AI tools. But I do think if you haven't jumped into some of these things, now's the time because the productivity gains are really compounding. Like I really think in the last 2, 3 months when Opus dropped, that was like a big step forward for the industry. And I'll leave you with this quote. I can't remember who said it. It was not me, but I like this quote that said, change has never been this fast, but will never be this slow again, which is a good reminder, but also mildly terrifying. All right, so some resources. Like I said, I posted these slides up on my blog, and I intentionally leave my slides pretty detailed so you can look later at like what I said exactly versus just like a picture that you don't remember what I said. But yeah, I know we're 2 minutes over, so maybe I'll hang out for a little bit for questions. Otherwise, yeah, thanks everybody for having me.